The text arrived late at night. "Honey, we need to talk about the trip. We've decided to postpone it until next year." Sarah blinked at the message, her heart sinking. Postponed? They'd been planning this trip for months, their first family vacation in years. She'd rearranged her work schedule, budgeted every penny, and counted down the days like a kid waiting for Christmas. She called her mother immediately. Her mother sighed as she answered, "Sarah, I know you're disappointed, but things are just tight right now. We can't afford it." Sarah swallowed hard. She understood money struggles. She really did. She had been working extra shifts at the bookstore just to pitch in for this trip, even offering to cover her own airfare. But something about the way her mother said it, like the decision had already been made, like her feelings didn't matter, felt like a slap in the face. Sarah took a breath. "If it's about money, maybe we can find a cheaper hotel or shorten the trip." Her mother hesitated just for a second, but Sarah heard it. "Sarah," she said gently, "it's just not the right time. We'll make it happen next year, I promise." A promise. One Sarah should have known better than to believe. 2 days later, she was scrolling through Facebook on her lunch break when her stomach dropped. There it was, a picture of her mom and dad on a beach. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. Sun-kissed skin, drinks in their hands, the ocean stretching behind them, glistening under the afternoon sun. She swallowed hard and scrolled down. More photos. Her brother, Mark, posing with his girlfriend on a boat. Her parents at a seafood restaurant, smiling over plates of lobster. And then the caption that made her blood run cold. "Family time is priceless." Family time, except Sarah wasn't there. Because, according to them, the trip had been postponed. She locked her phone and sat frozen at the bookstore counter, her mind racing. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. Maybe it was a last-minute work thing. Maybe someone had gifted them the trip. But deep down, she knew the truth. They hadn't postponed anything. They had just decided that she wasn't part of it. That night, she didn't call her mom. She didn't respond to the post. Instead, she watched in silence as more photos poured in over the next few days. They went snorkeling. They had bonfires on the beach. They made memories. Without her, and as she stared at each picture, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about the trip. This was about all the times she had been the afterthought, all the birthdays they had forgotten, all the holidays where her gifts were an afterthought while Mark got exactly what he wanted, all the times she made sacrifices for them, but they never did the same for her. Sarah clenched her jaw and took a deep breath. They thought she would be too hurt to say anything, that she would just let it go. But this time, she was done being the forgotten one. They didn't know she had seen the photos, so when they got home a week later, she was waiting for them, and she had a plan. She heard the taxi pull into the driveway and watched from the kitchen window as her mom, dad, and Mark stepped out, dragging their suitcases behind them. They looked tired but happy, sun-kissed from their postponed trip. Sarah clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. They didn't know she had seen the photos. Not yet. The front door swung open, and her mother was the first to spot her. "Sarah," she said, her voice overly bright. "Oh, sweetheart, I missed you. How have you been?" Sarah folded her arms. "Busy," she said flatly. Her dad walked in behind her, setting his bags down. "That's good. How's work?" Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh. Work? That was all she had done? Work and scroll through their pictures while pretending she didn't exist to them. Mark yawned, stretching his arms. "Man, I'm exhausted. Traveling takes it out of you." He turned to her with a smirk. "Hope you held down the fort while we were gone." Sarah's eyes snapped to him. While we were gone, like it was normal, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't spent the last week replaying their betrayal over and over. She took a deep breath. No more pretending. She turned to her mom, her voice eerily calm. "So, how was the trip?" Her mother blinked, hesitating. "Oh, well, we just needed a little getaway. Nothing too special." "Liar." Sarah pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward them. The photo album, the beach selfie, the boat ride, the fancy dinner, and the caption that made her stomach turn all over again. "Family time is priceless." She tilted her head. "Looks special to me." Silence. Thick, heavy silence. Then her mother let out a nervous laugh. "Sarah, I don't." Sarah's voice was sharp, cold. "Just don't." Her dad cleared his throat. "Look, sweetheart, it wasn't—" "Stop," Sarah said, her voice rising. "Just tell me the truth. You never postponed the trip. You just didn't want me there." She saw the guilt flash across her mother's face, but she quickly masked it with a weak excuse. "It wasn't like that, honey. We just thought—" "What? That I wouldn't notice?" Sarah snapped. "That I wouldn't see the pictures? That I'd be stupid enough to believe your lie?" Mark groaned, rolling his eyes. "Oh my God, Sarah. Are you seriously making this a big deal? It was just a trip." "Just a trip." The words hit her like a slap. A trip that she planned, that she saved up for, that she was supposed to be a part of. She shook her head. "You could have told me the truth, but instead, you lied. You made me feel like I wasn't worth bringing." Mark scoffed. "You're being dramatic." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "No, Mark, I'm finally being honest." Her mother stepped forward, reaching for her hand. "Sarah, please." Sarah pulled away. "No, not this time." They needed to hear this. This isn't just about the trip. It's about every single time I've been treated like I don't matter. Every holiday where Mark got exactly what he wanted, and I got whatever was convenient. Every time I put you guys first, and you didn't even notice. She swallowed, her voice shaking. "I thought if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough, I'd finally be enough for you. But I never was I?" No one said a word. Finally, her mother sighed. "Sarah, it's not like we love Mark more than you." Sarah let out a small, bitter smile. "Maybe you don't, but it sure feels that way." Another silence, and that was her answer. She nodded, exhaling sharply. "Got it." Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. "Sarah, where are you going?" her dad called. She didn't look back. "Somewhere I'm actually wanted." And then she left. For the first time in her life, she put herself first. For days, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from them. But she was done fixing things. This time, they could figure it out without her. She didn't answer their calls. She didn't respond to their messages. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't rushing to fix things. It was strange at first, ignoring them. The guilt crept in like an old habit, whispering in the back of her mind, "Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you should just let it go." But then she would remember the text saying the trip was postponed, the Facebook posts of them having fun without her, the lie they told without a second thought. And suddenly, the silence felt like freedom. By the 5th day, their messages had shifted. At first, they had been firm and dismissive, trying to regain control of the situation. Mom. Sarah, we need to talk about this. You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Dad. Ignoring us isn't going to change anything. Call your mother. Mark. Jesus, Sarah, get over it. You're acting like a child. Sarah rolled her eyes. Classic. They weren't sorry. They just wanted her to stop making them uncomfortable. But when she didn't answer, the tone of their messages shifted. Mom. Sweetheart, please. We miss you. We never meant to hurt you. Dad. We should have handled things differently. Let's talk. And then the one that nearly got to her. Mom. Sarah. I feel awful. I can't sleep knowing you're upset with us. For a brief moment, she almost responded. Almost. But then she asked herself a question. If she had never seen the photos, would they have ever told her the truth? Would they have ever felt guilty at all? The answer was painfully clear. So she locked her phone and let the silence continue. It wasn't easy. She had spent years being the one to reach out first, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made excuses for them. So, sitting with the silence, holding her boundary, felt unnatural at first. But as the days passed, she realized something. They weren't reaching out because they missed her. They were reaching out because they missed the role she played in their lives. The fixer, the peacekeeper, the afterthought who never made waves. And now that she was refusing to be that person, they didn't know what to do. A week after their return, Sarah did something she had never done before. She booked a weekend trip for herself. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet cabin in the mountains, far away from everything. She packed a bag, grabbed her keys, and left without telling anyone where she was going. For once, she wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting to be included. She was just living for herself, and it felt amazing. By the time she got back, her phone was full of missed calls and texts, but she didn't rush to respond. She wasn't ready yet. Because, for the first time in her life, she was finally putting herself first, and she wanted to enjoy the feeling a little longer. They weren't used to her ignoring them, so when her silence lasted longer than they expected, they showed up at her door, and she was ready. She knew it was coming. The moment she ignored their calls, their messages, their guilt trips, she knew her parents wouldn't just let it go. So, when she heard the knock on her door that Saturday afternoon, she wasn't surprised. She took a deep breath, setting down her coffee. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart wasn't racing. She was ready. She opened the door to find her mom and dad standing on her porch. They looked different. Not angry, not smug, not demanding. They looked nervous. "Sarah," her mom said softly, tucking her purse under her arm. "Can we come in?" Sarah leaned against the doorframe. "Depends," she said evenly. "Are you here to actually listen, or just to tell me why I'm wrong for being upset?" Her dad sighed. "We're here to talk, really talk." Sarah studied their faces. They weren't ordering her to let them in. They weren't dismissing her feelings like they had in their messages. They were asking. That was new. She stepped aside. "Fine," she said. "Come in." She led them into the living room. The air felt thick with things unsaid. Her mom sat on the couch, hands folded in her lap. Her dad stayed standing like he wasn't sure if he belonged. Sarah sat across from them, arms crossed, waiting. It was her mom who finally spoke first. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "The truth is a good place," Sarah said flatly. Her mother flinched. Her dad exhaled through his nose. "We messed up." Sarah blinked. She hadn't expected him to say that. Her mother looked down at her hands. "Sarah, when we said the trip was postponed, it was a lie. No excuses, no dancing around it, just the truth." Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. "Why?" She hesitated, then finally said, "We thought it would be easier." "Easier?" Sarah repeated, just like she had texted her. Sarah clenched her jaw. "Easier for who?" Silence. "For you?" Sarah pressed. "For Mark?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Because it sure as hell wasn't easier for me." Her dad ran a hand over his face. "We didn't think it would hurt you this much." Sarah scoffed. "You didn't think at all." Her mother's voice cracked. "We thought you'd understand." Understand? The same word they had used in their messages. The word that meant nothing. Sarah leaned forward. "Tell me the truth. If I hadn't seen those pictures, would you have ever told me?" Neither of them spoke. That was her answer. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced her voice to stay steady. "Do you have any idea what that felt like? To see you all having fun without me? To know that I was never even considered?" Her mother's eyes shimmered with guilt. "Sarah, we love you." Sarah shook her head. "You don't treat people you love like that." Her dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We failed you, sweetheart. We should have been honest." Sarah stared at him, then at her mom. "Why are you really here?" she asked. "To apologize or to make yourselves feel better?" They hesitated, then her mom said, "Both." At least that was honest. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, her mom said, "I don't know how to fix this." Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of all the years of being second place. And she realized something. She didn't need them to fix it. She just needed them to understand it would never be the same. "I don't know either," she admitted. "But I do know this. I'm not going to be the one to fix it for you." Her dad nodded, slow and understanding. Her mom wiped at her eyes. "What do we do now?" Sarah met her gaze. "That's up to you." They thought an apology would be enough, but apologies don't erase years of being treated like an afterthought. This time, they had to prove they were willing to change. Apologies were easy. Change, that was the hard part. After her parents left that day, Sarah didn't feel relieved. She didn't feel like anything had really been fixed. They had admitted their mistake, they had apologized, but she had heard apologies before. It was their actions that had always told a different story, and this time, she wasn't interested in words. She wanted proof. For the first time in her life, she didn't go out of her way to reach out first. She didn't text them good morning. She didn't send updates about her life. She didn't check in to see if they needed anything. For the first time, she made them do the work. And at first, nothing happened. Days passed, then a week, then 2. And Sarah thought, there it is. That's the proof I needed. If I wasn't the one putting in the effort, there was no effort at all. She should have known, she should have expected it, but somehow it still hurt. It wasn't until the 3rd week that things started to shift. It was a random Tuesday when her mom called. Sarah let it go to voicemail. Then came a text. Mom, hey, sweetheart, just thinking about you. Hope you're doing okay. Okay? A part of her wanted to ignore it, to keep the distance. But another part of her, the part that had been waiting for any sign that they actually cared, hesitated. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she waited. The next day, her dad texted too. Dad, miss you, kid. Let's get dinner sometime? Sarah stared at the message, emotions colliding inside her. Not because she was ready to let them back in, but because, for the first time, they were trying. She agreed to dinner, not because everything was forgiven, not because she was ready to pretend like nothing had happened, but because she needed to see if they were serious. They met at a quiet restaurant, just the 3 of them. Mark wasn't there, and that alone told Sarah they had been paying attention. They sat down, and for the first time in years, her parents asked her about her. Not about Mark, not about work, not about whether she could help them with something, just her. She wasn't sure if it was genuine or if they were just trying to fix what was broken, but for the first time, they were actually listening, and that was new. Halfway through dinner, her mom cleared her throat. We've been thinking a lot about what you said, she said carefully, about how we've treated you. Sarah took a sip of her water, staying silent. Her mother continued, and we've realized that we've always assumed you didn't need us the way Mark did, that because you were strong and independent, we didn't have to put in as much effort. She met Sarah's gaze. And now, she swallowed, and now we know that was wrong. Sarah glanced at her dad. He nodded. We see it now, Sarah. We do. For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say, because those were the words she had been waiting for her whole life, and yet part of her still didn't believe them. Not yet. By the time dinner ended, something had shifted, not in a dramatic, everything is fixed way, but in a, maybe this time they actually mean it way. They still had a long way to go, but for once, they were the ones taking the first steps. And for now, that was enough. But words were still just words, and if they really wanted to fix things, they were going to have to prove it. Dinner had gone better than Sarah expected, but she wasn't naive. She knew that one meal, one conversation, wasn't enough to undo years of being treated like an afterthought. She wasn't looking for a quick fix. She wasn't looking for another empty apology. If her parents truly wanted to change, they had to prove it. The first real test came a week later. It was her birthday, and if history had taught her anything, it was that birthdays in their family had never been fair. Mark's birthdays were always a big deal. Parties, gifts, dinner reservations at whatever fancy restaurant he wanted. Sarah's, a card, maybe a phone call if they remembered. So, she told herself she wouldn't expect anything this year. She told herself she wouldn't care. And yet, when she woke up that morning, there was still a small part of her, the part that still wanted to believe they could change, that hoped this time they didn't forget. At exactly 10 a.m., there was a knock on her door. Sarah frowned, setting down her coffee. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she saw her mom and dad standing there holding a cake. Her breath caught. They had never done this before. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," her mom said, offering her a tentative smile. Sarah blinked at them. "You remembered?" Her dad let out a small chuckle. "Of course we did." And for once, Sarah believed them. They didn't just drop off the cake and leave. They actually spent the day with her. They didn't do anything extravagant. Just a quiet afternoon at her place, talking, catching up, eating cake that was a little too sweet, but still perfect because it was hers. There were no rushed goodbyes, no feeling like she was just an obligation. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they wanted to be there, and Sarah didn't realize how much she had needed that until it actually happened. A few weeks later, they proved it again. Sarah had a big presentation at work, something she'd been nervous about for weeks. She had mentioned it briefly over dinner one night, not thinking much of it. But when the day came, she got a text from her mom. "Mom, thinking of you today. You're going to do great." And then one from her dad. "Dad, let us know how it goes, kiddo. Proud of you no matter what." Sarah stared at her phone for a long moment. They had never done this before. She wasn't used to them remembering the little things. And yet here they were, trying. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where old habits crept back in. Her mom still occasionally defaulted to making excuses for Mark. Her dad still struggled to express himself in more than a few words. But the difference was, they caught themselves. They noticed when they messed up, and they tried to do better. And that mattered. One night, a few months later, her mom called her. Not for anything in particular, just to talk. And at some point in the conversation, she sighed. "I know it's going to take time," she said carefully, "for you to trust us again." Sarah swallowed. "Yeah." A pause, then. "We're not giving up, Sarah. You're too important to us." Sarah felt her throat tighten, because for the first time, she believed her. But for the first time in her life, she finally felt like she mattered. Change didn't happen overnight. There were still moments when she caught herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her parents to slide back into their old habits, for them to forget to stop trying. But weeks passed, then months, and they kept showing up. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't effortless, but for the first time in her life, she finally felt like she mattered. One evening, Sarah was sitting on her back porch sipping tea when her phone buzzed. It was her mom, not an apology, not a guilt trip, just a simple text. "Mom, thinking of you. How's your week going?" Sarah stared at the screen, something warm settling in her chest, because that message wouldn't have existed a year ago. A few weeks later, Sarah got another surprise. She had been saving for a trip, a solo vacation just for her. She hadn't told her family much about it, mostly because she didn't want to deal with their opinions. But then, one night at dinner, her dad asked, "So, when's your trip?" Sarah blinked. "You remember?" He smirked. "Of course. It's Italy, right?" Her mom nodded. "We were actually talking about it the other day. Do you need help with anything? Packing, planning?" Sarah studied them carefully, waiting for some catch, but there wasn't one. They weren't offering because they wanted something in return. They were offering because they wanted to be part of her life, and that was new. The night before her flight, Sarah got a text from Mark. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. "Mark, Mom won't say it, but she's freaking out about you traveling alone. You know how she is." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Typical." Then another message came through. "Mark, you're doing it, huh? Living your life on your own terms." Sarah hesitated before replying. "Sarah?" "Yeah, I am." There was a long pause before his final message arrived. "Mark, that's kind of badass, sis." As Sarah stepped off the plane in Rome, the weight of the last year settled on her. She had spent so much of her life waiting for her parents to see her, waiting for them to include her, waiting for the day when she wouldn't feel like an afterthought. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She was choosing herself. She had built a life where she didn't have to chase their approval, and somehow, in doing that, they had finally learned how to show up for her. A few days into her trip, Sarah was sitting at a cafe when her phone buzzed. A group message. "Mom, we just saw your latest photos. Rome looks amazing. Call us soon, we miss you." Sarah smiled, not because she needed their approval, but because, for the first time, they weren't just saying the words. They meant them. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. You shouldn't have to beg for love. You shouldn't have to fight to be included. And if the people around you don't see your worth, choose yourself. Because sometimes when you stop waiting to be seen, that's when they finally notice.